Today we're going to talk about the 10th house, but not about career. It's about,
The mother-in-law.
yes,
Dun dun dun.
yeah, because 10th house is the significator or the house that represents the mother-in-law. And hopefully it's not a monster-in-law, but in a lot of cases, it seems that that's the case because that's the cultural joke across the entire globe, the mother-in-law jokes.
I think all of us can somehow relate to a difficult mother-in-law or somebody we know of who has a difficult mother-in-law.
And on that note, I kind of want us to go through the whole configuration of the chart to see why the 10th house represents the mother-in-law and why the 10th house positions this human being in a difficult way in life in general. Like for someone to be a good mother-in-law will require quite a bit of effort. Just looking through the way the chart is set up and how there's a house-to-house aspect. So yeah, we'll talk about that. And there's a specific yoga for the 10th house, which I think will come in handy and it's significant when it comes to the mother-in-law. We'll look at that too.
Sounds good.
All right. So
If anyone has any mother-in-law stories, leave them down below.
do leave them down below. Like all my life growing up, I think all my life, I heard at least someone saying something about some mother-in-law. It's a very common narrative.
Yeah, more so than the father-in-law. Like nobody
Yeah.
really talks about a father-in-law.
Yeah. And I feel that the mother-in-law, like the woman who marries a man, the mother of the man, when I think about back at all the narratives, is usually she's portrayed as the problematic one. Because the mother of the woman is usually the narratives that I've heard and I've come across is actually maybe even being too accommodating to the husband, whereas the mother should be more accommodating to her own daughter. So this is an interesting dynamic for us to kind of explore and see what is this
You
mother.
mean to the son,
Well, let's say
which,
I get married to a guy, my
yeah.
mother would be his mother-in-law, right? And I'm saying in the context of the daughter, a lot of times the mother-in-laws will protect their son-in-law.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. You're right. 100%.
Yes,
100%.
right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then the woman, her spouse, the mother of her spouse, is protecting her own son. So she's
Yeah.
kind of left kind of helpless on both ends.
Yep.
So this is a very common narrative. But I am sure there are men who also have crazy mother-in-laws too, but that's not the narrative that people generally talk about. And I think this cuts very deep, not just cuts deep in a sense of we can go even beyond astrology and bring psychology and sociology into astrology, and astrology can actually support these frameworks and theories beyond itself too. I hope we get to that also, the power dynamics in society and how they end up playing themselves out and how the chart actually represents it. It's quite cool. Should I just quickly go over the significations of the 10th house and then connect it to the rest of the chart to see why we get mother-in-law in the 10th house?
Yeah, because it's actually quite interesting. I never would, I guess, unless it's like your mother-in-law's basically because you end up once you get married, it's your life and your career is to be her slave.
That's so funny. Okay, so the 10th house is a house that's usually generally related to our careers, right? But it's also the house that it's at the highest point of the charts. It's where we are most visible, and it is a house that represents our power in the external world outside the context of our home sphere, domestic sphere, which is the fourth house opposing the 10th house. So the 10th house is also about fame, and it is also a house of movements, represents the concept of the wind, so we can climb in terms of our status and our position in the 10th house. Other dynamics to keep in mind about the 10th house. 10th house is always squaring the first house, which is the self, and the seventh house, which is the house of marriage, right? So we're bringing someone in relation to ourselves and to our marriage, and we're putting him in a position of power, and its opposition is the fourth house, the house of the family. So the mother from the domestic sphere, from the background for the first time, becomes a prominent figure within their family, within the 10th house. It's taking the center stage. Like even when you go to weddings, there's great attention on the mother-in-law. The father-in-law usually goes under the radar. But I don't know if you've ever been to wedding ceremonies where the mother-in-law is like next to the bride, she's the star of the show. So she gets elevated when her child gets married and she comes to occupy a position of power opposing the fourth house. So even in this kind of a dynamic, we can start to see how this 10th house is squaring the self and the marriage relationship in the seventh, and it's opposing the fourth house of the family. And then the 10th house is an Artha house. It's a wealth building house. And it's trining the second house, which is about our fixed assets and our support system and how we receive support in life. And the sixth house is also trining it, which is about the house of how do we make ourselves of service to other people. So we'll come to see when a mother-in-law is functioning properly, she knows how to make herself of service in that context of the trine within the sixth house. But when it's dysfunctional, the mother-in-law is trying to take that new son or that new daughter and make them subservient and of service to her and her need. How to get that support of the second house, for example, now as the mother-in-law. So even when we take the chart house to house dynamics into consideration, we can start to see that certain power dynamics come into play, certain spheres of life, like the first house ourselves, fourth house, our family dynamic, and our marriage is coming into relation with the 10th house, which is signifying the mother-in-law. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of the mother-in-law problems, specifically when it comes to the mother of the guy, so the husband's mother, it's like a mother, it seems to me, a mother who has a hard time differentiating that life cycle that just came to an end, which is that we're supposed to raise and groom your son to let him go and to start his own family. That so opposing the 10th house is the fourth house. In the first half of life, the fourth house is saying something about the families we're born to and the way we get raised. In the second half of life, when we have our own families, it's saying something now about the kind of family dynamics that we have. So the job of the mother in her as a socializing agent to her son in a healthy way would be that, hey, I'm going to give you all the tools to be able to eventually have your own family. But it seems that some mothers can't comprehend that. You know, they can't let go of their son. They still want their son. And then there are the narcissistic mother-in-laws where they actually have this idea that their son is something like their spouse because of the kind of support, like that second house perspective that they want of their son is something that your own spouse should be doing for you. But they have this sense of entitlement to their son that it's you're supposed to support me the way that perhaps my own spouse should have supported me. And then when now the wife is saying, no, we have our own family, we need to do our own thing, the mother-in-law is now starting to sabotage. She tries to maintain her position of power in the 10th house, you know, so you get all of these strange, weird dynamics from an unhealthy mother-in-law. And there are certain planets in the 10th house that's indicating a fair, a wise, a loving mother-in-law. And then there are certain planets that are saying that when you have this signature in your chart, when it comes to the mother-in-law, be prepared, like brace yourself. You're going to get that cynical, that critiquing, that intruding, violating, just an overbearing and an overwhelming mother-in-law.
I think for some mother-in-laws, it's also like a rite of passage. They had to go through it.
Yeah.
Because in the perfect sense, when your son gets married, you're
Yeah.
supposed to take your new daughter-in-law as your daughter almost, right? Like,
Yes.
but I think sometimes if it's just a reoccurring thing through generations,
Yeah.
well, my mother-in-law treated me like this and
Yeah.
vice versa. Or like, and down we go down the,
Yeah.
generational trauma.
Yeah, and we can go a little bit even deeper with it in terms of oppression and power dynamics. I was kind of bringing this up last night as something that we could discuss in this video. It's got a sociological component to it. When a woman has, in the past, traditionally got married, her husband would be in a greater position of power. Even within the charts, the fourth house is representing the domestic sphere where it's hidden, where it's private, it's internal. And then the woman's occupation was to be within this hidden sphere as the mother. And then the father traditionally belonged in the 10th house, which is the outside world, have a career, have power. And we know when a person in a relationship dynamic has the economic upper hand, they tend to have power, right? So now the woman stuck in the domestic sphere, there can be that sense of oppressiveness from the male who's controlling the finances and the economic aspect in the fourth house. The only time this woman will come into a position of power is in relation to another woman. Now, an outsider is coming within the context of her family sphere. So now she gets an opportunity to exercise and practice her power in an oppressive way over the new bride, for example. So traditionally, when we look at many different cultures, this is a theme. It's like the mother-in-law can become oppressive to the daughter-in-law. And it's
Because she was
because,
oppressed.
yeah, because this is the first time in her life now where she gets to have someone be subservient to her, serve her, listen to her. I'm the eldest. That is my son. These are our family assets. These are our resources. So I tell you when to sit, stand, and breathe. It's overwhelming, you know, but she couldn't do that with her husband. She couldn't even do that with her son because the son is following the footstep of the father. And even the son, as he gets a little bit older, he still has more power than the mother because all the resources were traditionally going to be transferred to him. So then he was still going to decide what her destiny would be. So, in order to control her own destiny, she better learn how to manipulate and control her son. She doesn't want to be lonely in her old age. You better know how to keep that son around. You want to have resources and financial means, you better control that son. And if a woman's coming in and if she's dictating to the husband, then it leaves her vulnerable again, right? So we can see like these social dynamics, how they're playing themselves out in the chart and even the way the chart is systemized the way that it is in its aspects, like house to house aspects.
Is it
And
also like you were saying, like obviously unhealthy, but when when he was a child or codependency?
yeah, a lot of times too, you know, you look at it, we want to just blame the mother-in-law, for example, but that woman or that man who has gotten married, they are also showing a huge vulnerability and powerlessness and immaturity too. Because like a mature woman or a mature man would stand up to their own mother and be like, why are you interfering? This is my family now. This is what I need to do. But a lot of people will succumb to their mother. It's like suddenly they become mommy's boy and mommy's girl, and that ruins relationships very fast. And in a marriage, you don't want to feel like you're an outsider to your own marriage, you know, that there's a third party involved. So yeah, these kinds of dynamics comes from the mother-in-law because of the way she raised that child of hers. But at the same time, we're talking about a child who's also lacking proper maturity to know how to deal with his mother and his wife or her husband and her mother. It's just given into it like, well, my mom said, but it makes my mom happy. If my mom's not happy, well, it's like, really? Now you have your own family. What are you talking about? But that's how it goes. And I've seen relationships end because of the in-laws.
Oh yeah, and I think I know a lot of relationships who would like to end, but just can't because of
Just
also cult.
unhappy.
Well, they're unhappy, but I do think in certain cultures, it's just you're brought up with a certain expectation that that's just how it is.
Mhm.
We all had to go through it.
Yeah, but doesn't it make you wonder, is that mother-in-law really happy to see her own kid and his family life or her family life and the spouse being so unhappy? Everyone's at conflict. There are so many movies made about the misery of the holidays because you have to hang around the in-laws. It's kind of a blessing when you think about it. You actually have the opportunity to have a second set of family in this life. And then it just becomes another huge pain in one's life. Because I don't think anyone in this life can cause a human being more pain and devastation than their own family and the people that they come to make a family with. So if these dynamics are unhealthy and they're just these distorted power dynamics, it's horrible. It's horrendous. Why do people do that to each other? I don't know.
Well, so how can you see that? Like if somebody comes to you and
Yeah.
they say, like, look, I'm having a difficult relationship with my mother-in-law
Yeah.
or soon to be mother-in-law, whatever it is,
Yeah.
can you see like how can you see like basically you're saying if certain planets are sitting in that person's chart,
Yeah.
then you can tell it's going to be difficult, but can you also maybe see if it's going to improve?
Yeah. Okay. So we have to take the condition of the 10th house into consideration. So that means what kind of sign is there? What kind of planet is there? What else might be conjunct this planet in the 10th house? Where has the ruler or the lord of the 10th house gone to? What are the aspects of the 10th house? But taking a very raw interpretation and considering planets that are malefics or benefics, we can right away come to figure something about the intensity and the dynamic of this house. So let's say, let me start with benefics and the good ones. So we have the two benefics of the great benefic Jupiter and the benefic Venus sitting in the 10th house without any harshness, and they're dignified, as well as Mars, as well as Mercury and Moon. These four planets in the raw interpretation, when they're dignified, strong, prominent, and positive, it's indicating that you have in-laws who are supportive of your relationship, of your marriage, for example.
Did you just say Mars?
No, I corrected myself. I meant to say
Oh,
Mercury. So Jupiter, Venus, Mercury,
okay.
and Moon. And I'm going to
Okay.
talk about how we're just saying how when they're good, how they can do good. So let's say we have a Jupiter in the 10th house. One of the blessings to have from an in-law in our lives is to have wise in-laws, like a wise mother-in-law. So let's say you've been bickering about something with your spouse for the past 2 months, and there's been fights and conflicts. And then the person's like, let's just talk to my mom, right? Let's just get a referee here. This Jupiterian mother-in-law will sit both of them down in a very wise manner, try to tell them about what life is like, what compromise is about, why they need to work this out, what the bigger picture is, what the lesson here is. You know, it's going to create that kind of a feel in the 10th house. When we have Venus in the 10th house, Venus is dignified and working really well. This mother-in-law is going to try to encourage how they can stay connected, why their marriage matters, how they can compromise, how they can cooperate. Mercury will become a great diplomat here in a sense of, okay, let me listen to your side. Let me listen to your side. Do you understand what this person's saying to you? And do you understand how you're making this person feel? And a lot of times when there's conflict in a relationship, the two people might even be saying the same thing, but because of their feelings, they just can't hear each other. Mercury here can really allow the communication between these two people, between the couple to flourish. Moon, when it's dignified, I'm going to talk about when Moon can really go awry in the 10th house with the mother-in-law concept. But when Moon is dignified and prominent in the 10th, it can take a nurturing aspect to both parties of how they can care for each other. So it brings that embracing, holding that space for them and holding them together so that they can work things out. So from here, should I go to the malefics or should I just talk about when these planets are not doing well, these benefics are not doing well in the 10th house?
Yeah, I would do that because we're already
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's say we have these four planets that can act like a benefic, and then suddenly we have a situation where, let's say, they're debilitated, their dignity is low, they're prominent, but they're negative. So they're not acting nicely, right? And we got to remember, 10th house is always squaring the first house. It's always squaring the seventh house of relationship, and it's always opposing the fourth house. So the mother-in-law, the poor mother-in-law, no matter how we flip the coin, is always, even if she is at her best, she's always in a compromising position. She's also walking on broken glass and eggshells, not to offend the selves of this relationship, not to violate their marriage, not to intrude in their family dynamic. So when it's benefic, it understands these dynamics and it knows how to navigate it to keep this couple's sense of personal integrity intact, their marriage intact, to keep all the family dynamics together. So, but let's say when Jupiter is not doing so well, it's not dignified, it's struggling, you can get, look, a wise person has to be able to understand the perspective and the totality of the relationship. Jupiter here can have, for example, some ideological standards of how things ought to be and not really putting their problems into context. So it'll create an ideal of how things should be in a marriage, how couples should be together. And this idealism will create more conflict between the couple. It's not going to help them. Even when Jupiter is not doing well, I still prefer to have Jupiter as a mother-in-law, for example, than other planets. Venus and Moon, both of them can bring biases, same with Mercury. So they don't really function on the benefit of the couple. They're trying, but they can't. They're violating either that first house thing or the seventh house or the fourth house aspects of the chart. They're not understanding how they can mediate in the 10th house as the mother-in-law. Moon can bring a sense of jealousy, for example, even though the moon is considered a benefic. And this is a huge problem with mother-in-law and their daughter-in-law, is the mother-in-law can be jealous of the daughter-in-law and the dynamic that she has. And we know when people have a feeling of jealousy, for example, they are not good people to speak to. Their advice is always distorted. Even if they're trying to give you good advice, there's something of self-interest in it for them. So genuinely at the depth of it is not good advice. Venus can also do the same thing. If the mother has some sort of an over-attachment or unhealthy love for the son, even though she understands the necessity of his marriage and it's good that if it's healthy, that subconscious programming in the background will distort what the mother-in-law is trying to do.
Yeah.
So it can indicate these kinds of you can, for example, with the moon, this is the time where the mother could be stepping in to say, like, I'm nurturing both of you, but pull him to the side and give him something a little bit extra that sets him off against her. You can get these kinds of dynamics, even with the benefics. Yeah, sure. We'll go to the malefics.
Well, you talked about Jupiter and Venus. What about Moon and Mercury? Same idea, I
What
guess.
about moon too? Just can bring that
Oh, yes.
jealousy, overprotectiveness. Do you know what I mean? It becomes lump-sided.
Mercury.
Mercury can be indifferent, right? Mercury has this air quality of, in those moments where people are at conflict and you're trying to be the referee, you're supposed to demonstrate some degree of passion and care for the situation, but not necessarily for the individuals in it. And Mercury, because of that air quality and the non-committal thing in it, it can have this it can be too impartial. So it becomes hard to rely on it when Mercury is not dignified. It's like, is Mercury actually really helping, or is this just someone who's there? This can also, Mercury is the gossiping planet because it's a planet of communication. It can talk. So Mercury can indirectly take what it learned in this dynamic, take it back into the fourth house dynamic of her own family and start talking about the problem, and then the rumors spread, and then it gets back to the ear of these ones, and then another problem. So we could get these kinds of problems, or like Venus in the 10th when it's not dignified. You can get a mother-in-law who shows too much understanding for her son's indiscretion, for example, or for her daughter's indiscretion with fidelity. It's like, oh, like son or daughter, do that again. It's not good. But there should be a little bit more to it.
Yeah.
Let your child know, your grown-ass child know that this is not the proper dynamic in a partnership. Yeah. As we'll see, it's not going to be as bad as the Malefic, but when the Benefics are not in a strong and a healthy position in the 10th house, they lose their ability to help compared to the way they can be when they are very dignified and powerful in the 10th house. They can actually diffuse things. They can help. They can build their daughter-in-law and their son-in-law's sense of self and strength. They can impart what they have to strengthen their relationship. They might even come because of their own relationship, become models and role models for their own kid and their son or daughter-in-law. They become an exemplary model of how a marriage could be. I remember having this discussion with someone I was in a relationship once and saying that our parents should be the people who are guiding us towards how to work things out because we don't know how to do it. We're new. You know, when someone has a kid, when the couples have kids, they say it takes a village to raise a kid because this couple is new at it. They don't know how to do it. The second child's always easier because now they got the experience. The same things with marriage. People watch movies, people have ideals of how a marriage ought to be, but then when you get in it, there are so many problems, there are so many obstacles. And then to have wise people who've gone through it and just to come and impart that wisdom, it is of utmost significant. And unfortunately, that's not what it happens in a lot of cases.
A lot of times, like you said, you get married very young sometimes, or you're like you said, even if you're not young, you don't know exactly what you're doing.
Yes.
You don't know how to compromise, you don't know how to deal with it. But yeah, a lot of times you get married the second time and it's amazing.
Because you learned. Now you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the whole point of these families are to be able to impart that knowledge and be like, you know what, you guys were going to argue about money. There are times where you don't want to be intimate. There are times where you've both changed and you have different expectations. Now imagine a mother-in-law who comes in, you're not accommodating my son, or my daughter doesn't have the lifestyle that she's accustomed to. It's like, whoa, there was fire already, and then you're just pouring gasoline on top of it. That doesn't help anyone. They need to learn. These are teachable moments, right? So yeah, you can get these kinds of dynamics even when you have benefics here, when they're not in a good condition, they're just not able to impart this and to help the couple. They can become indifferent or become too idealistic or gravitate towards one side, and all of these things shakes that relationship even a little bit more. But when we bring malefics here, it's a completely different story. Now,
malicious.
Yeah, now we go to the category of the evil mother-in-law.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. So let's take Saturn, for example, because I feel that a lot of mother-in-law stories I've heard, they have a Saturn flair to it. I don't like the way that you clean your house. I don't like the upkeep of this. I don't like how often, like, you cook this food for my son and he's getting high blood pressure. That criticism, do you know what I mean? That negativity that they bring, that detachment that they bring into that dynamic, it's very Saturnine. Or just constantly trying to create limits and boundaries of how things ought to be with their son. Therefore, you need to be more of this, less of that. Don't do that. Don't raise your kids like that. It's got this covert thing to it, but there's this nitpickiness to it that's over the years, after like 10, 15 years, it's just chipping away at trust and at confidence, at sense of settlements, being grounded. It's just that mother-in-law is taking that away from the daughter-in-law or the son-in-law or that marriage. They can never praise. They can never come into the house and be like, wow, you look great. They'll come and be like, why you look so fat? Are you
Yeah.
not eating healthy? Do you need some help? You know, it's like these kinds of where you just feel rattled and unsettled all the time. And I think like all these movies that are made about like holidays with the in-laws that's so horrible, it's talking about this covert Saturnine quality of critiquing coldness, the pessimism, the cynicism that Saturn can bring. It's talking more about that kind of malefic nature. And I've said this in other videos, like Saturn's not like Mars that will just take out the swords and the guns and it wants to go. It goes into like these covert enduring wars with very small battles that by the end of it, you just feel so depleted that you submit. And Saturn represents people who are underprivileged, underclass. So we're talking about a mother-in-law who wants to create that kind of a dynamic. You're my slave. You are subservient to me. You are below me. I am his mother. What I say has way more power over you. I gave birth to him. You don't dictate, I dictate. You get this kind of a feel from a Saturn that is undignified too, especially in the 10th house. You can get a very strong dignified Saturn in the 10th house. And I would say this kind of a mother-in-law, she doesn't necessarily have a solution for how to make your marriage happy and healthy. But she will prescribe to the couple, for example, just bear through it. Life is not all peaches and cream. It's not a bed of roses. It is about pain and suffering. Marriage is about pain and suffering. You guys chose to do this. You can bear it out. And there is some truth to that to some degree, right? But it's not imparting the wisdom of like Jupiter would, of okay, bear the hardship, but the objective should be goodness and joy at some points. But the Saturnine person will bring the significance of what it means to endure the difficult aspects when Saturn's very dignified in the 10th house and it's strong and prominent. But when it's negative, you get that nightmare consistently just chipping away at your confidence, that first house aspect of it, creating a cynical perspective of relationships, who he is or who she is as the spouse, who they are to each other, that seventh house square of it. And then the lack of significance in their current marriage and family life relative to the family that he comes from. So it creates these kinds of dynamics. And with the Saturn, you can also get a mother-in-law who's very controlling of the money aspects, which is that second house thing. Like we control the resources. We tell you what you can and cannot have, you outsider who's come into our family and trying to take our stuff. I tell my son or my daughter what you're entitled to and what you're not. These kinds of restrictions create very unhealthy marriage dynamics. You lose trust in your spouse, you lose trust in his family or her family. So yeah, it just becomes Saturn can become very overbearing as a nasty mother-in-law.
I guess maybe a little. Is it basically because Mars would just be very sharp,
Yeah, we'll talk about Mars. Yeah.
but Saturn is more cannot like drags it like makes it almost evil.
Yeah.
Not evil, like drags it on, like finds like little pokes and little jives and
It's covert Saturn.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And you know what? I mean, people underestimate how much Mars, you know how Jupiter is the greater benefic and then Venus is the lesser benefic? Yes, Saturn's malefic, but the greatest malefic, it's actually Mars. And what Mars will do in the 10th house will make Saturn stuff feel like child's play. Okay, because Saturn doesn't want her child's marriage to break up. But this mother-in-law just can't stop the criticizing and oppressing and suppressing and repressing, all of these limiting, these kinds of facets of the mother-in-law comes out. But at the end of the day, if you actually dig into this mother-in-law, she'll be devastated if her son or if her daughter gets a divorce. The great,
Devastated because of society or devastated because she's actually devastated?
because this is the thing, when a child fails in the relationship,
It's a reflection on the mother.
yes, she was a failure to some degree, that her son or her daughter's marriage failed because she's going to sit in gatherings and so what happened? Oh, she was so evil. But the background of that is that your son also didn't have the skill sets to be able to cope and to deal with it, to neutralize it and to diffuse it. So the mother, to some extent, is a failure too. And Saturn's enduring. Once when Saturn chooses a position, Saturn it's like related to traditions. It wants to hold on to that. It doesn't want the status quo changed. So once when the son or the daughter is married, she will be devastated, this Saturn 10th house mother-in-law, to know that her husband or I mean her son's or her daughter's marriage broke up. On the other hand, Mars, the great malefic, is trying to break them up. This is what makes Mars a greater malefic. So when you get Mars that's not strong, it's undignified, it's acting negatively in the 10th house, you have that mother-in-law who's creating conflict with their own child to go back home, everything within their power so that their kid will actually break up with their spouse or their partner. That's what that mother-in-law is doing, which makes it a lot more malefic than Saturn. Because there are sometimes that people even through all the conflicts, they prefer to be with the person that they love. They don't want to break up. But the Mars mother-in-law is plotting and planning in the background so that their child breaks the marriage. They'll encourage, you should just divorce her. She doesn't do this for you, she doesn't do that for you. She's not like this. You deserve so much better. So what the Mars mother and mother-in-law in the 10th house is doing is that square aspect of it to the first house, pumping up their kid. Like, you do so much, you're so good, you have this, you have that. Why would you stay with her? Look at her or look at him. They have nothing. They're a nobody. So they're just in the background creating all the weapon and ammunition that their kid needs to sever the dynamic and to end it. So this is what you get when the greater malefic Mars is sitting in the 10th house. I would take Saturn over Mars any day. I don't know, maybe not, because that
Well,
Saturnine
Saturn
quality can be very draining.
draining, but I guess they still want to make it work. So you can stick it out until,
Yeah.
you know.
The person is saying a person who has Saturn in the 10th house, yes, it's saying something about their mother-in-law, but it's also saying something about them too. So they probably have some enduring quality in them too. And they might start putting boundaries around their mother-in-law in terms of like, you can't do this, you can't do that. They can become critical and nitpicky too, right? So they can control each other in some way. It becomes a controlled dynamic of setting limits and boundaries for each other. But with the Mars situation, you if you have it in your 10th house, you either have to go and cut off the mother-in-law or you have to end your marriage. It's like severe. It's not helping us. But let's say Mars is dignified in the 10th house. So let's say Mars is exalted, Mars is sitting in its own sign, it's getting glorious aspects. This could be a mother-in-law who has a lot of passion and fire for the relationship. It's like you guys have to, relationships are a war. Life is a war. You just fight through it. It doesn't even matter if you guys half kill each other, you guys fight.
Oh, really? Oh my God.
You know? The thing with the malefics is they can't define the joy at the end of it. Like, why are you keep putting up with things like the way Saturn does? Like, why do you have to suffer? And then with Mars, why do you have to fight? It's the point for the malefics is for Saturn's always to suffer because that's the nature of marriage. And then for Mars is like the nature of marriage is war. So you just have to fight. Whereas the benefics will be like the point is joy and love and harmony and peace and tranquility. The problem with the malefics in general is that they can't do that. And then like having a Mars in the 10th house as a mother-in-law too, sometimes you see this, the mother-in-law fights fiercely for their kid. And in a relationship dynamic, the partner is already an outsider. They're already they already are obligated to work extra hard to have a sense of inclusion and belonging. And when you have a mother-in-law that's against you, because Mars is always about oppositions, you feel like you never belong in that family. You feel a sense of exclusion at all times. So the Martian mother-in-law can do this. It's not nice. The person just feels like an outsider all the time. Saturn can do the same thing too with the coldness, but Mars, you explicitly feel the other person's fight against you. So the option usually becomes, do I cut off the mother-in-law or do I fight? Or does a mother-in-law triumph and cut off this relationship and split things apart? So you can get these kinds of dynamics.
But I mean, mostly if you were looking at somebody's chart and they came in with a Mars sitting in there, obviously you'd say that this could be the potential seed.
Yeah, if that Mars is not functioning too well in the 10th house, you can foresee that even if they're not married currently, they might have a fight in their marriage with the mother-in-law in the future. I think we should also talk about the sun and the nodes, and then briefly talk about that yoga in the 10th house with the planets. So the sun is a mild malefic, and I feel that when the sun is very dignified, is very strong and positive, the mother-in-law is an authority figure. She's the stabilizing factor in everyone's life. So she has that authority to step in when things are going sideways in the relationship and be like, I put my foot down. If you guys don't stop doing this, then you guys are jeopardizing this. There's an assertiveness where her word is taken seriously. She has she has healthy kind of power. And the sun does really well in the 10th house. The people are looking at the sun figure who's prominent and positive, and they're like, she knows what she's talking about. Let's just follow through with what she says. But you get a sun that's, let's say, debilitated, it's suffering, is not dignified, it's not strong, but it's trying to exert its authority and power. It's going to bring in oppressive power because it needs to demonstrate its own power. Like you see this a lot with the mother of the sons, where she needs to have a sense of power because that's her son. Because I said so. I show up to your house because I'm the mother. Like, what are you saying? I tell him what to spend and when to buy a house and when to get you in this because I am the mother. Suddenly, being a mother becomes like a position of power in that marriage. But this is an unhealthy son. It's like, why are you trying to exert your power right now? This is not even your marriage. This is not your family in a sense of like the way they're trying to build a family. So it just becomes a very authoritative, dictatorial, over dominating kind of an in-law, mother-in-law. So the sun can become very overwhelming like Saturn, but in the opposing way. Saturn's trying to chip away at you, but the mother-in-law as that dysfunctional sun is trying to overexert her power and her dominance and her presence. Like when I show up to a room, why are you not getting up and bowing to me? It's overwhelming. It's overpowering. So yeah, we get that kind of dynamic with the sun and the 10th. The nodes, they just amplify whatever that's in the 10th house. So let's say we have a sign or a planet here that is benefic. The nodes are actually going to try to amplify this. And then let's say there's like Venus and Rahu sitting together. You can kill them with kindness. There is such a thing. You just do too much. Like, why are you cooking a souffle on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and coming over to their house? The mother-in-law might think that they're doing it from the goodness of their heart, but it's just being over amplified to a point that's overwhelming now. So you can get these kinds of dynamics with the nodes like compulsion, impulsiveness, overdoing things. So whatever that's happening in the 10th, the nodes will amplify those qualities in the 10th house. Then this is something very important to remember about the nodes. They're like a magnifying glass. So every good and bad quality is just getting magnified and amplified in that house. And then when there are eclipses, of course, that's another story with the nodes, but just the nodes themselves sitting in a house.
It's amplifying the like that how what that house represents basically.
Yeah, whatever condition is in. So if it's not in a good condition, it's going to amplify that difficulty of that house. It just makes it eternally difficult. And then when it's benefic, it will amplify that. But the problem with the nodes is that when you put a magnifying glass, let's say on a word, it distorts all the other words around it. So it can become nonsensical too. So you don't want to amplify a good thing too much either because you're creating distortion in that environment. You, it's like literally like too much of a good thing. Water might be good for you, but at some point when you overdrink it, it might kill you. The nodes can have this kind of a feel, just over amplification of things where there's just no more bounds. It becomes difficult too. But at least like I don't know, over exaggerating a good thing is probably better than over exaggerating a bad thing. That's the way I would look at it.
And they're both doing it, right?
Yeah, they're both doing it.
And then I guess if there's other planets with it.
You know how to think about the exaggeration of the nodes is that, let's say we take Rahu and you put a magnifying glass, so it's like enlarging that thing, making it like expanding it bigger. You put Ketu, you know how some cups, because of the dent that they have, if you put it on a word, it looks super far and small.
Mm-hmm.
So Ketu has that kind of an effect. So it will distance itself too much from the actual reality of things. But again, it's distorting it because that word, its size just changed and became like a fine line. You have to focus so much to be able to read it that you can't pay attention to the surrounding words. So both of them are distorting because they're making things disproportional to other things that are there around it, the connecting factors to it. You don't come to see the connective tissue of the entire problem. You just get hyper focused on one problem. That's what both Ketu and Rahu do, but Rahu's making it larger and Ketu's making it such a fine print that you need the entirety of your vision's power to just even make it out. Your brain starts hurting because of the distance. It's like, what does that say? I can't. Why are you doing that? Like, I don't get it. What is the point of this? You got that kind of a feel with K2. And a mother-in-law who's just getting hyper focused on anything within their kids' marriage, it's gonna create a problem. They lose the perspective that it's their marriage, this is how they do things, the connective tissue of their relationship. But the yogas, just very quickly, there's a general yoga that happens in the 10th house, which is you must have only one planet. You can't have conjunctions. Just has to be one planet in the 10th house by itself. And it cannot include the nodes, the sun, or the moon. So we are left with Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. So when you get these planets, but only one of them at a time, in the 10th house, you have this yoga. When it's a benefic in the 10th house, at some point of life, you will get an extraordinary benefic result out of that house. When it's a malefic, you will get an extraordinary malefic result out of this out of the 10th house. It's like the malefics will bring some sort of a disgrace, and the benefics will bring some height and prominence to the 10th house. So you get like a Mars in the 10th house, that could mean that the mother-in-law, in the case of the mother-in-law here, it's a huge thing if someone's marriage ends, if a long-term relationship ends. It's like on the negative side of the spectrum of the checklist. Like none of us are looking on our bucket list to get a check mark on divorce. At least I've
Yeah.
never heard a bucket list with divorce in it.
Well, now it's very common to have divorce parties, though.
But do you think anyone has a goal to be divorced one day?
You don't know, but I do know someone, and she has a wonderful relationship with her ex-husband. They co-parent amazingly.
Yeah.
They both met other people. They just kind of were just, it's not for, like, we don't work.
Yeah.
So they were like, it's a good thing we got divorced. We actually work better for our children that we're divorced. And they actually get along great. So, but yeah, obviously nobody really goes into a marriage thinking that and being like, yay, I can't wait till I get divorced.
Yeah, you know how people make their 5-year plans. I can't imagine someone putting on that get married and get divorced, and especially because of my mother-in-law or my own mother.
But this yoga you're talking about, it's also everything related to the 10th house, not
Every,
just mother-in-law. Okay.
everything related to the 10th house. Yeah. So, let's say a transit is happening. Let's make it very severe. It's a dasha period of that house. So that's activated. And let's say you have a certain a certain transit happening at the same time that it's connecting it to your marriage within the context of the 10th house, to the context of your 4th house. So now we can see that it's starting to talk about the mother-in-law components. But if you have, let's say, another transit that's more related to your career life, then that's what's going to get activated. Because the mother-in-law is a signification for the 10th house, that's one of the things that could be related in your life. Your relationship or your marriage ends because of your mother-in-law that's sitting now in the 10th house. That yoga could come to indicate that because that's a 10th house signification and this is a 10th house yoga. Yeah.
But if it's a benefic planet,
Yeah.
it's something good that's going to happen in your marriage.
Yeah, you know what? You might actually, let's say, yeah, something good could happen in your marriage. But historically, there's been a lot of marriages that have been set by families,
Yeah.
right? So maybe that mother-in-law initiated this beautiful marriage and you guys are compatible and you guys love each other. So yeah, it could be something like that. Or later on in life, you guys need the wisdom of, let's say that we're talking about Jupiter, you need the wisdom of your mother-in-law and the benefic nature of it. You need money and that Venetian aspect of it in the 10th house. It comes to the rescue of the marriage. So yeah, it acts in like a benefic way. Saturn might, I don't know, put you in jail or something.
Really?
I'm just saying. Because Saturn represents like boundaries and limiting you, you know?
Oh my
You're on
God.
house arrest. The mother-in-law called the cops on you, and you're like, no, I'm just joking. It doesn't have to be that, but just taking Saturn's raw interpretations and meanings.
And Mercury?
Let's say you guys want to start a business. The mother-in-law can come to help you in some sense.
Okay. But this yoga in general, I know the topic's mother-in-law, but it's going to enhance or affect negatively
Mhm.
all aspects of the 10th. So your career or fame or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. It won't have, this is the funny part about a lot of yogas. It's not that you have a yoga and consistently every day you're living that yoga. Usually they get triggered, right? By dashas and by transits. Even when you have yogas that's indicating a very important and a prominent person, you weren't necessarily born that way and you don't necessarily go out of the world that way. It's denoting a phase of life when that thing is triggered and it has its time. It's going to live its time and then it fades into the background. Like the dashas are kind of like this too, right? When a planet wakes up, when its dasha system that, or in Western astrology, they call it zodiacal releasing. When that planet is awake, it's able to do certain things because of the power that it has, because it's becoming conscious. And then once when that dasha period ends, that planet will go to sleep, even though that planet is eternally in your chart. So it's only activated for a certain amount of time. So these are some things to consider and
Okay, so it has
contemplate.
to be yeah, so it has to be like some part in your life where it's triggered either by dasha or transit or whatever.
Yeah. For example, like I'm in my moon dasha right now, right?
Mhm.
So my moon's activated. All the other planets are dosing off in a slumber. However, This means that my moon has the most amount of consciousness and conscious awareness about my experience of the world. But that moon is aspecting others. So everything's being filtered. Like all the aspects in my chart right now are being filtered through the moon's gaze. You know, the moon's also the ruler of Cancer. And I have Saturn in Cancer. So Saturn's not fully asleep because moon is keep wanting to interact with it. Moon is sitting in Aries. So the ruler of Aries is Mars. So moon is constantly want to interact with Mars. So you can see how when moon comes to interact with these other, because of that connectivity and the dispositor of the chart, the planets are coming into a conscious state to interact with the moon because of experiences that the moon needs to have, the karmic batch that's connected to the moon right now. So yeah, the 10th house too, that yoga, it can be activated at a certain time to deliver a crop of karma that we need to experience in this life. And then, so it's like if it's a malefic, it doesn't mean like 24/7. It's like that malefic yoga is activated and you just want to like not deal with the 10th house matters or the mother-in-law at all.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to be searching their 10th house.
The 10th.
That's why she's like that.
It's just when I think about some people who had to deal with these kinds of things for like 30, 40, 50 years, I don't even know how people do it, to be honest.
Why, that's what I was saying. Some people are just conditioned, right? Like that they grow up just being like, well, that's just how you have to live.
That's normal.
Yeah, that's normal. That's what all of us have to go through.
If you experience that yourself as a woman and you know that did not feel good, why would you impose it on someone else? What makes you think that makes
We
another person feel good?
I think it's like what you were talking about earlier, it's that power dynamic. Like I had to be the slave and now
You're the,
I yeah, I want to make someone else that person, unfortunately. I
yeah,
mean, they even talk about it. Like I know abuse has like abusive, right? Like they say a lot of times if your parents abused you, you'll also potentially hit your.
yeah, that's true.
So even though you know it's wrong, if you're getting, hit as a child or something, you probably know it's a horrible thing to do. You know it's wrong, but
Yeah,
you end up becoming that. You either I think it goes two ways. You either end up becoming such a like so against it,
yeah.
or you end up becoming that, not because you think it's right,
Yeah, do you think
or
about
you're
the
con-
conscientiousness of it though, that it's actually not right, or they just like what you said earlier, that's just how
or
it's
maybe yeah, you know what? Actually, maybe that's exactly what it is. You're right. It's probably they grew up with this horrible feeling, but then they're like, you know what? That's just how it is. Yeah, I don't think, yeah, exactly. It's not right or wrong like that, but it's just like, I had to go through this. This is normal.
And you know, I feel like when you have these malefics or these signatures as difficulting, it's indicating a difficult mother-in-law, but indirectly is also indicating a difficult spouse. No?
Yeah. Well, yeah, obviously, if your spouse can't, if the mother, yeah, 100%, if the mother-in-law behaves that way
Yeah.
and the spouse just sits back and is okay with it,
Yeah.
100%, of course.
They're enabling it.
Yeah. They're both enabling each other. They're like, that's why I brought up the codependency. It's almost like they're codependent.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember in my relationship, me and my partner got into a little bit of a back and forth. And then his mother was there. And in that moment, when I think back, if that happened, if I have a daughter and that kind of a thing happens, I would try to be the referee in the middle to help them trying to understand each other. But her first instinct was to attack me and to create a confirmation for her son. And then in that moment, I just felt like I was having a dissociative kind of a experience. I saw her son suddenly like puff up and then he's like pouncing on me and then there's her also doing it too, and I was just like like this feeling of overwhelm. So as a mother-in-law, that was the wrong way of doing it, and as the son of the person too, you have to exercise a lot of discernment and your own power not to create these kind of lump-sided power dynamics in a marriage, because how many times can a person go through that until they're just like your mother is cut off. If you go to your mother's house, then it's cut off, and then we're over, or No one ever sees each other on holidays, or it's just big fight and a big mess 24/7 at all times. It's just so
Yeah.
unhealthy. I don't understand how these kinds of dynamics will go on and on and on. But like you say, if people deem something as normal, then
Well,
that's
that's a sad thing. You
fine.
don't break that generational like
Yeah,
curse, I don't know,
but
whatever
you
it
know what
is.
though? I don't think it's normal because when you see people who experience these things, even if it's culturally quote unquote normal, the stress, the disconnection, the lack of happiness, the misery is there. So I don't think it's a normal human condition because when something becomes normative, like a certain degree of stress in our lives can become so normative that we don't feel it as stress anymore. In fact, it becomes our strength. It's like getting a conditioning to get thicker skin. But when you see people in situations like this, they're miserable. So I don't know if it's normal because
Hmm.
it seems that no one ever finds their happiness in those kinds of situations or feeling settled. Like, it's okay. I'm totally fine. I don't mind. She can do more of it.
Like you were saying, like you don't think it's a normal thing.
No, because our emotions never adjust to a sense of joy about it or being okay with it. We don't look at it ever as this is my strength. We feel it as misery.
But I think some people do. Like I actually genuinely have seen son-in-laws or like the son, the husband, or even the mother being like, even the wife, by the way, I know we're being biased and only talking about the son. There's a lot of women
Yes,
who
of
are like,
course.
my father or my family, like
Yeah.
you have to be like that. But they're proud of it. They have no issue with it.
Yeah, but the marriage I'm saying is never healthy.
Oh, yeah, of
It's
course. Yeah, yeah.
always a miserable marriage. So I'm saying even if we like to normalize it and say that's how it's always been, is we don't become accustomed to that marriage feeling good ever. It's just coping through the years, whether if it's the son or the daughter, the woman or the man. Like a terrible mother-in-law, the only like healthiest coping mechanism is to become indifferent to his family, right? And that's not healthy either in the long run of life because you're gonna have kids, they want to know their grandparents. There's just so many conflicts that will come out of it. It's never ending.
So, I mean, if you ever get into a relationship like that, probably need some major counseling.
Probably, right?
Well, I mean, if you're going to try to make it work without losing your sanity, yeah.
Yeah.
Like if you're going to stick it out for whatever reason, you're going to, yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but you know what though? Even when you do go to counseling, you're just learning coping mechanism because if the other people are not a willing party to also have a look at themselves and what everybody can do, and that sense of burden and pain of it will never really go away. You're just learning better tools of how to cope and set limits and boundaries and how not to take things personally in an area of life where you want it to feel personal. They are your second family now. And I think subconsciously we want them to be our families. We want to give that love and to receive that love. And then I think on the other end of the spectrum, we can talk about unhealthy daughter-in-laws and son-in-laws too, because a lot of us will start a relationship or go into a marriage with these preconceived notions, like the wicked, evil stepmother narrative. There are a lot of stepmothers who are probably more of a mother than that person's own mother. More love, more kindness. But we have this strange narrative that every stepmother is evil, every mother-in-law is evil. So we might actually step into it with our guards up, defensive, every little things they say that we become hyper focused like that Rahu or Ketu there,
Yeah.
hyper vigilant about everything. So we might be the ones sabotaging that dynamic too. But coming to the point of this video, the 10th house is talking about the quality of the mother-in-law. But I'm saying in real life, the dynamic is not always one way either. People feed into each other or people come in with their preconceived notions.
Yeah.
But just again, as always, as raw interpretations, because we're talking about the 10th house and the mother-in-law. Yeah.
And so the 10th house, though, is also your own father, right?
Yeah. Represents your own father, represents your career. Yeah. Your degree of power in the external world.
So isn't that like it's interesting though, right? Like your mother-in-law and your own father. Like what is the connection? Is there any connection there?
Well, your mother-in-law is, I was trying to explain at the beginning of the video, for the first time, it gets the same kind of power that your father had.
Okay, so okay.
She is external. Now she is
Like your own father. I thought she was like you were saying like her husband. Like
you know, she's becoming like the father figure in the 10th house relative to her child after when they get married.
okay, okay.
To that newcomer. Do you know what I mean? They have that authority, they have that power now because they gave birth to that kid, their son or their daughter.
Yeah.
And the fourth house represents womb to tomb, right? So some mothers will take that literally
Oh
from
my
my
God, that's
womb,
so yeah.
from my womb to my tomb. When I say live, he lived or she lived, and when I say die, they die. You know, you hear some very like overwhelming statements. I have heard them throughout life. People, the things that people say, China.
Yeah, so that's why I'm like I think a lot like the ones that are extreme, like there's a serious co-parenting trauma or like something, right? Like there's clearly a dysfunction
Yeah,
with the person himself
yeah,
and obviously his mother. I mean,
yeah.
you could probably understand a lot about your partner from their parents.
100%. Yeah. And you know what? It's every time you pay attention to the terrible mother-in-laws, when you pay attention to their marriage, they don't have healthy marriage. They're actually taking their own kids to fulfill a role that their spouse should fulfill, especially
Yeah,
if it's a son to a mother.
yeah.
It's like why do you expect him to love you in that way? Why are you trying to control the finances in that way? It's really weird. It's a little cringy when you think about it. And like you're saying, is codependency and just a lot of weird, unhealthy dynamics that are now seeping into another person's life, which is very unfortunate because they just probably want to be married to that person, but not to the strange dynamic that's coming along with the marriage, you know?
Well, that's why a lot of places they say you're not just marrying the person, you're marrying the family.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I think that's up to the son or the daughter to draw healthy boundaries, right? Especially when people have kids, these dynamics get very like complicated. At the beginning, it's just about like your appearance and your house and what he needs or what she needs. And then next thing you know, and people get super overprotective when a mother-in-law is telling them how they should raise their kid and that they're wrong. It's like the person already doesn't like you. Like now you're coming in and yeah, just super complicated and weird. Hopefully, my prayer is that we all be blessed with beautiful in-laws, that we're endowed with a second set of parents who are wise and loving, and so we can all augment each other's joys, because that's a blessing in life to have two families, two tribes converge. That should make you stronger, having more, being more, the ability and the potential to do more, to love more, to give more love. It's supposed to grow you. So I hope we will all either heal our crazy family dynamics or just end up with people who are good in-laws. I don't know what to say. It's a hard one to negotiate in life.
Yeah.
Yes. Anything else we'd like to add to crazy in-laws
Well,
or
I guess to
fantastic
be,
in-laws?
well, that's what I was going to say. I think we should end it on a note that a lot of people have wonderful mother-in-laws
Yes.
or and father-in-laws and everything in between. And
Yes.
it's not always, not everyone is fits that mold.
No, no, definitely not. But now I'm being very Saturnine myself. But we don't have a cultural joke of the fantastic in-laws. The cultural joke coming across the globe is like, oh my God, going to the in-laws house. So,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, but yeah, a lot of people are blessed with good in-laws, and I hope we all are.
Otherwise, I hope we all learn how to keep them at arm's length distance.
Now you can beat the Saturn. Okay, good. All right, shall we wrap it up here?
Yeah, sounds good.
And then maybe in one of the next videos, we can talk about the father-in-law, which is the third house. So that was it for today. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
Much love. Till next time.